the MoGraph workflow has a very particular application in, it's workflow in that there are three different things that we need to look at. I'm going to break this down so that we look at probably only one of the things, which is the cloner, and then the rest of the, so that you guys can get the principle, and then the rest of it will largely be Ellie showing you the different things. But there are three main sections to the workflow for MoGraph, and you have to start with a MoGraph generator object, which is one of these things in green. Okay, so one of these is a MoGraph item, and it then turns something into a MoGraphable item, if that's a word. But a MoGraph generated item, you know, we're going to be looking at the cloner and the Voronoi today, but you know, the workflow will work pretty much the same with those. That's the first thing we'll look at. We're then going to look at these blue ones over here, which are the effectors, and they affect things. Again, it will become more obvious when I actually start affecting things. And then we have fields, which are these pinky things over here. So these are the three things that we're going to look at. And you can't really do MoGraph without looking at all three of these things at once. So it can get a little bit confusing when I jump between one and the other. But bear with me, and we'll do our best to make sure that you understand the principles of them. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to look at my MoGraph generator object, the cloner. Okay, the cloner does exactly that. It creates clones of things. So let's create something to clone. Let's create a sphere. It wasn't a cube for once. Now I have my cloner and I have my sphere. Because the cloner is a generator, as we looked at generators in week 2, you know that we need to put an object inside the cloner to make it generate. So drag and drop the sphere into the cloner, and funnily enough, we have a set of clones. Now, very simply, by default, my cloner has some little orange handles, and you'll be used to these orange handles from when we did parametric modeling and various other things. The middle handles allow you to control, in an organic fashion, the size, the overall spread of the clones. There are corner dots as well. And what these corner dots do is actually allow you to create more clones. So there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. There is the drag and drop that corner, which is quite nice. There's the drag and drop that corner as well. I'm not quite sure why it's changing height. That's interesting. Let's just reset that. Okay. Or if you have a specific number and a specific distance you want to set, over here in the cloner object attributes manager, we can choose the number of clones we want. So let's make it 10, and let's go crazy. This is a grid system, so let's go 10 by 10. Woohoo! If my maths is all right there, we've now got 1,000 clones. 1,000 spheres all sitting there on my screen. And we can choose the size per step, which means let's make it 250, 250, 250, which means that the center of these spheres, and that's the axes, is 250 centimeters apart. It's not the gap between the two spheres, it's the gap between the central axes of those. So that is what we call per step mode. I can change this to endpoint. And what this does, this says this is the maximum size that I want my cloner to be. And if I increase the number of clones in it, then they squidge in. So the size is the same, but the number of clones that are in there increases or decreases. So that's endpoint. Whereas if I did per step and I increase it, then it will get bigger because it is increasing every time it adds another count. It adds that step onto the outside. So that is one way that you can use the cloner. This is in its default setting of grid array. We have a linear size as well, a linear mode as well, which allows you to, funnily enough, just create clones in a line. And again, I can choose per step or I can choose endpoint. You can see that that really wanders off. Let's bring that back a bit. Let's make it closer. and then let's go. There we go, and we're making clones in random directions. So this is a linear direction, and you can control it more by going further away or up and down or left and right. You can even do scale. So if you wanted it to get slightly smaller per step as well, then you can. And it will continue, it will get smaller until it gets to a point, which is quite weird to do with maths, when it inverts. So you can see that at one point it gets so small that it starts going the other way, and then will continue getting bigger the other way. This is an interesting thing when it comes to scaling things using the cloner that way. Anyway, so let's just set those at 100. And you can control their rotation. Not that you would be able to see it at the moment because it's in the sphere. So let's swap that out because this is what you can do. Let's create a cube and put the cube in the cloner and get rid of the sphere. Although before I do, look what we've got. I have cube, sphere, cube, sphere, cube, sphere, cube, sphere, going all the way along. And this is because it is cube, sphere. And if I wanted it the other way, it would be sphere, cube. And that's the way it would clone, just by default anyway. I'm just going to get rid of the sphere so that we've just got the cube. And then if I change my angles, you can see that the whole thing twists around, which is quite an interesting effect, really. Whee! All for the per step as they all turn around and move for the information that we have being provided by our object tab for the cloner in linear mode. We have a radial array, which is a different way of doing that. I'm just going to grab my orange handle, which funnily enough produces a radial array of the clones. And I can increase the number of clones that there are. I can change the start angle from 0 to 100 or minus, so I can start further round. I can increase the radius or decrease the radius. I can choose the plane that it's created on. I can even choose an offset so that how far round it goes, or offset variation once you've got an offset, and then it will randomly distribute the cubes around the outside. So there's quite a bit that you can play with there if you particularly want to, but that's the radial array. Of course, we had the object mode that we looked at last time. So if I just create a sphere, and let's make that sphere huge. Under my clone, it says, what object do I want to clone to? And let's clone to the sphere. And now you will see that I have tiny cubes dotting the surface of my sphere, which I can increase dramatically. I can choose to have them on the surface, so it's a random distribution. I can have it per vertex. I could have it per edge. I can have it in the polygon center. I can even fill the volume, which is what we've been previously looking at. So there are quite a few tips and tricks that you can use the cloner for when using it on an object, which is quite nice. There are a few different things that you can do. It's an incredibly versatile tool. Our generator is our cloner. And then the grid array, which is the first one that we were looking at. Let's get rid of the cube, that now. And you've got a honeycomb array, which funnily enough produces a staggered honeycomb, which is great for, creating honeycombs or bricks or paving or walls and things like that. And that's the cloner in a very small nutshell.
We have a couple of questions, if that's okay.
Yep, I thought that might be a good point to stop.
Cool. So the first one is, can the cloner go to infinity and beyond, in brackets, or does it have to have values?
It has to have values. You can't increase indefinitely because Cinema can't handle infinity. That's not a number it truly understands. So you need to set values to it, and you will find that if you tried to do 1 million all the way across, Cinema 4D may struggle a smidge depending on what it is you're trying to clone.
Yeah, it handles clones very well, but yeah, it has its limitations to the amount of geometry. Okay, cool. Another one. So Anna's having some issues whenever I scale an object, before putting it into the cloner then resizes it back to the original scale, and then I have to resize the cloner. How do I keep the object from resizing? it shouldn't resize if you have just the cloner.
Yeah,
Um,
it shouldn't. Is the answer to that one. It shouldn't
unless
do
you
that
have
at all.
scale values in the cloner. So I'd recommend delete your cloner, get a fresh one so it's all default,
Yeah.
and then drop it in, because it shouldn't resize.
If you're using the scale, which is a slightly different thing because you're scaling the model, or no, that should work. No, I don't know. I don't know why you'd be having that issue.
So yeah,
I've
try
not seen that.
kind of clearing out your cloner and
Yeah,
get a fresh one and see if you still have the same issue. And if you do, let us know and we'll try to figure it out. I've got another quick
yeah,
question.
of course.
Can you scatter objects based on points with the cloner?
Yes, that's what we did with the sphere. So if I make that sphere, I'm going to bring that back down from 1,000 clones. There is my that. So let's put this back to object mode and let's view our wireframe. So in my cloner, let's map that to that. And on my cloner, rather than polygon center, we can choose vertex, and that is the number of points. So if I take my sphere and it's got 16 polygons, so let's times by 2 to get more polygons, I get more points, therefore I get more clones. And you can also do it to splines as well if you want to.
After scaling or moving an object, how do you get the little dots back to modify it? Could you just show how to get them orange
Yep.
handles?
So you need to make sure you are on the cube, and then you are on object mode, and then you are on one of the move, scale, or rotate tools, and that will give you the orange handles. The original clone disappears when my cloner is on. So if I turn off my cloner, then I can go back and edit my original and turn it back on. And now I will have spiky cube, spiky spheres.
Cool. I just had another one coming in, which is quite a good one. What are the limitations / advantages of the different instance settings in the cloner? So instance, render instance, multi-instance.
Good question.
I know
They
multi-instance, I think it's multi-instance, doesn't work with dynamics properly.
right. And then render instance will be a direct copy. So if you want to really know and probably go into more depth than I can probably go into right now, right click, go to show help.
Yeah. So if we're looking at advantages, so what's happening? So instance is it's instancing the same object again, whereas a
Yep.
render instance, your playback and your scene will be faster because it's just like a render instance. And yeah, multi-instance, is it multi-instance doesn't work with dynamics, or is it render instance?
I can't remember which way around it is, if I'm perfectly honest. I always use render instances for effects, e.g. dynamics. So a render instance will do that, but a multi-instances won't.
Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah.
There we go. Anything else?
Yeah, I think that's it for now. Yeah, anything else that
Okay.
comes in, I'll let you know.
Right. Then let's create a new scene, funnily enough. So let's create a cube and a cloner, put that in there, and let's make this 25 by 1 by 25. Let's make the per step 250, 0, 250. Wrong way around. 1, 25, bang. Hurrah! So that is a cloned cube 25 by 1 by 25 with a size of 250, 0, 250, which means that there is a little bit of a gap between each of these cubes, which is exactly how I want it. So this is the cloner. This is a MoGraphable object. As I've said, there are a few others, and we'll look at the Voronoi, but the principle is the same. So I can do some things with my cloner. As you've seen, I can change the sizes, I can move them around, I can spread them out. But what if I want to interact more with the clones? What if I want to affect them? Hint dropping. Then we need an effector. So with my cloner selected, because then it makes an automatic association, I'm going to click and hold, and I'm going to have a look at some, well, I'm going to look at one of them at least. All of these effectors that we have here, they do exactly that. They will affect the clones, and they will do it in different ways. You can affect them based on sound. You can affect them based on time. You can affect them based on a Python scripting if you really want to get involved in that way. You can push them apart. You can re-affect things. You can do something very plainly, which is what I'm going to do. So with the plain effector, I'm going to do that. And you see instantly my cubes jumped up a smidge. If I turn off my effector, down they go, on up, down, up. Why do that, I hear you say? Why not just move the cloner up? Well, good point. So let's have a look at my plain effector, and let's have a look and see what it's actually programmed to do. And I can do that by looking at my parameter. And my parameters at the moment is adjust the position of the clones, 0 on the X, 100 on the Y, and 0 on the Z. Let's make it a bit more obvious. Let's make that 1,000. Wait, now if I go up and down, there we go. It does that. I can also change the scale. I can also change the rotation. So let's click on the rotation as well, and let's choose 90 degrees. No, let's not choose 90 degrees. Let's use 45. And I need to turn my effector back on. There we go. So you can see this is the original location of the clones. I put my effector on, and my effector has turned all of the clones 45 degrees and moved them 1,000 centimeters up. Not the most exciting, I'll grant you, of things that you can do with your clones, but this is an example of getting you used to it. So we have a clone, we have a MoGraph object. I then affect the MoGraph objects with an effector. But as you can see, this is having an effect again on all of my clones all at the same time. Well, what if I didn't want it to do that? What if I want to choose where the effect is having an effect? To do that, we will go to my last tab, which is called a fall off. And this fall off literally means where will this have an effect? So very similar to when you're using paint brushes and it's, you know, in Photoshop or digital art programs, and you've got it's 100% in the middle and 0 on the outside, that it will have a gradient between really hard and 100% brush stroke and 0% to give you that nice fade on the outside. This is exactly the same principle. It is where do you want stuff to be affected versus not affected. So with the fall off, you see that I've got access to my linear field, or my fields drop down here, which is the same as my fields drop down here, but this one automatically associates it with the effector that I have selected. So let's create a linear field. Click that button and bang. There we go. I have now 3 stages of my object. I have 100% affected up here because they're green and they've turned 45 degrees and they're higher, and the 0% affected. I also got this middle ground, which is halfway between the two. And this is thanks to this field. This is my field, this orange thing, because I have it selected. If I deselect, you'll find that it is, of course, purple. And by default, it has associated itself with the plane effector. It's got our famous orange handles, and this is the area of effect. So this line here denotes 0% affected, and anything behind it is unaffected, as you can see. This line represents 100% affected, so anything on this side of it is 100% affected. And because this row of clones is smack bang in the middle, they are 50% affected. So let's see what happens if I spread these out a bit, and you can see nothing at this point until it overlaps the center axis point of these clones. And now if I spread these out, you will see that I now have a gradient of these, and I can completely expand it out. And if I move them, you can do that. They'll change because obviously when it's affected, depending on the position of the actual linear field itself, if it is on this side of the 100%, it will be 100%. If it's on the other side, it will be 0%. So you can get some really interesting effects by simply moving this thing from left to right. And this is where fields makes all of the difference to where you can affect your clones and what is happening. So let's have a look. There are three things that we have. We have the cloner, and this controls the clones themselves. Actually, we've got four things. We've got the object being cloned. So if I want to change the size of the cube, I can do that with my cube. So let's make my cube taller. Fine. If I want to choose the way it's being cloned, then I use my cloner, and let's make it 30 by 30. Okay, if I want to choose how it's being affected, then I use my plane. This is my effector, and I can say, let's make it 750 tall. And as well as 45, let's do 45 degrees that way as well, so it spins them all. Then I do that with my plane. And then where this is all happening, I choose with my linear field. So that is the process. That is the thing that you need to be aware of. Depending on what you want to change will depend on which one of these you need to click on to adjust. So there is all of a sudden three things that I need to throw at you in order to get this, but it's the only way that you can do it. Fields becomes really even more interesting when you look at the fact that you've got blend layers, because you can have more than one field affecting an effector. So let us create a spherical field. Now I have a very tiny spherical field. So let's increase the size of that spherical field. And now I have a spherical field that is also doing the same thing as the linear effector was. So wherever the spherical field was, those clones change rotation, height, and whatever. But you can choose how this blends. So at the moment it's maxing it out. I can do minimum, so it will only do it where the two overlay. I can do subtract, so that it'll take it away from wherever the original one was doing its thing. I can turn off the color of this one using the three color icons, and I can choose not to have the color being affected by that one and just roll those over. I can overlay and add them together, and so that it's maxed out by one and the other. It's, you know, there's quite a lot you can do really, which is a really interesting way of manipulating clones, adding things around, moving them, and being able to affect clones. You can even do things with a random effector as well, sorry, random field. So let's turn off those two fields for the moment, and let's turn on a random field. So this is the only thing now controlling. I've turned the other two off from here and here. The random field, which is basically a large noise map, is now choosing a random distribution of a linear effect. So the linear effect is that they will either be up or down, but this is a random distribution of that. And my random field can change. I can increase its scale so that it can be a bit wavier. I can choose noise, I can choose random. I can just randomly press that. And it's a really interesting effect to be able to completely change the way this stuff happens. And now maybe, okay, let's add the spherical field back in. Let's move that to the top. And now I can overlay the two. So wherever the spherical field is, the random effect, the random field of the plane effector has some form of effect. And that, again, in a very small nutshell, is fields with relation to effectors when it comes to MoGraph.